Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Unscripted History, where today we'll be going over the Siege of Syracuse, which lasted from spring of 213 BC all the way to autumn of 212 BC. So just kind of start off this, I'll give a brief preface. So the Siege of Syracuse has quite a bit of history because it was sometime after the end of the First Punic War, we see as the city of Syracuse becomes its own kingdom, the Kingdom of Syracuse, and it becomes allied with the Roman Republic. And we just kind of see as this continues, and then ultimately we see as the king who was like the first major king of Syracuse, Aero the second. It's Hiero, and Air is pronounced like that, so I'm just say Aero. So, see, he ultimately dies, and his grandson, Erotimus, ultimately then becomes the king. However, he dies very early on in his reign because he's assassinated, and also during his reign we see as pro-Carthaginian, political individuals ultimately start to rise. However, before his ultimate assassination, we do see as these pro-Carthaginian forces, these Carthaginian proponents ultimately do end up falling out. However, Rome is still worried about the possibility of a uprising of some sort in Syracuse joining with the Carthaginians. And then in 214, their fears are realized because we see as during this time, they served under the They had served under Hannibal Barca, specifically Pisides, who was a Greco-Carthaginian individual. Him and his brother Hippocrates ultimately end up taking the city of Syracuse for themselves and then becoming antagonistic towards Rome. So as this happens, obviously the Romans cannot have a pro-Carthaginian force on their front door during the Second Punic War, which lasted from 218 to 201 BC. So they plan on taking Syracuse. So we see in 213 as the proconsul Marcus Claudius Marcellus, and then also his it's a specific title of praetor, but one of the praetors by the name of Appius Claudius Pulcher ultimately end up going against the Syracuse people and attack the city, which ultimately becomes a siege. So, in the defenses, we actually see some very, surprising technology for the time. We see as the Romans ultimately end up making these floats that are essentially floating siege towers with grappling hooks to try and get over the walls of Syracuse. However, Syracuse had their own ace up their sleeve because they had Archimedes, the dude known for the sphere, the Greek, or at least the Hellenistic, mathematician and scientist. And he came up with some wacky inventions to defend the city. So he created what is known as Archimedes' claw, which was a claw. It was like a crane-like hook that would bust into and grab Roman ships and lift them out of the water and drop them to their demise. So they had some pretty tough opponents here. However, the Romans are kind of unable to deal with this at first, and we see as they take some pretty big beatings for the first a couple of months. However, we then ultimately see, because of this kind of going poorly on the Roman side, we see a stalemate happens, and during this stalemate no one's really able to make any progress. But we do see as the Carthaginians start to make some more progress. They do try and assist the people of Syracuse by attacking the Roman forces from land. However, they're unsuccessful in this because a lot of their forces at the time were focused in Hispania fighting the Romans. Therefore, they were unable to effectively fight the Romans here in Syracuse. However, we do see as Himilco, who is a military leader within the Carthaginian forces, is actually able to start taking some Sicilian cities, which is very important because Sicily gives the Carthaginians a pretty nice, jump-off point to then attack mainland Rome. So, after this, we see as it drags out all the way into the year 212 BC. But the Romans ultimately end up strategizing a little bit and are able to take advantage of something. The city of Syracuse's annual festival for Artemis, they got overconfident because the Romans were unable to take the city in the time that they had been there so far. So you know what? They're like, we're going to party like there's no tomorrow. And there was no tomorrow for them. But yeah, so we see as they all go to party, and you know what the Romans do? These bums are leaving their posts, so they end up jumping the walls and taking the entire wall and outer city of Syracuse on the night that everyone's celebrating and having a jolly good old time. So they take the whole city, but luckily the Syracuse and the military forces are like, oh, yo, they're attacking. So they end up barricading themselves within the citadel, or the inner city of Syracuse. And so the Romans are then left with another siege on their hands, because they are forced to now bust the Syracuse civilians and military out of the inner citadel. And this one is a lot easier because it's a lot smaller area. And also there's just a lot, there's just not as much assistance for these Syracuse, since they're actually within the city rather than without, because prior the siege had been so difficult because they really couldn't defend the entire city. They would be spread too sparse, and the Syracuse were just able to continue bringing in supplies and stuff like that, even though the Romans were technically sieging them. Now, though, they had a proper siege going on. They were able to cut off essentially all supplies. And this ultimately led to an individual by the name of Moriscus, who was one of the 3 prefects of, I think it's called Archidina or something like that. And we see as he ultimately ends up getting a little bit of a, yellow stream running down his leg, a little bit of quaking in his boots. So he ends up going to the Romans, and he's like, yo, I'm going to let you in. I'm not taking this anymore. I want to save my own skin. So we see then as, he ends up going in there, and the Romans, we see he one night just pulls up, opens the gate for the Romans, and the Romans sack Syracuse. We see as everything ends up going down, the entire city is taken, and it is ransacked. Everything is destroyed. Civilians are killed because the Romans have been tired of being in the city and losing their men to this siege for so long. So they just end up going and blasting everything. They start wiping out everyone. And we don't have exact counts on the losses. However, it is stated that the Roman losses during the siege were very high, or significant. However, we do have a little bit more of a sure estimate on the Syracuse casualties. We see that about 5,000 were killed and a large quantity of civilians were killed. So this sack was pretty major. Now, what happened to Archimedes, you may be asking? Because Archimedes was the one who established the defenses of the city with stuff like ballistas, and I believe they're called onagers, which are essentially just catapults. Well, we see once the city was taken, or at least the outer city was taken, Archimedes was captured. But ultimately, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, ultimately ended up telling the troops, don't kill him, because he was like, I know what this dude has done, and we can use him. So one day we see as Archimedes is doing his thing, studying, doing some math equations. He's doing his a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, hold up, I don't even know. I'd have to research. I don't know if the Pythagorean theorem was, in existence at that time. I'd presume it was, but yeah. So we see as he's doing his stuff, and then one day a Roman soldier comes in and he's bothering him, and Archimedes is like, yo, get out of here, buddy. The Roman soldier just straight up kills him. And so, because he didn't know who Archimedes was, so he just slobs Archimedes, and Archimedes dies at the ripe old age of 78. So, also, you may be asking, since Syracuse had a coexisting population of both pro-Carthaginian and pro-Roman citizens, what happened to the pro-Roman ones? Well, once Marcellus ultimately ended up taking the outer city, and before Moriscus actually gave up the inner city, we see as Marcus decided, you know what, I'm going to put guards on the pro-Roman civilians' houses so that they are not killed. So the pro-Roman individuals actually did not end up dying, which is good. But yeah, so I guess kind of the aftermath of this siege, we see then, like I said, as the city of Syracuse is taken, and then ultimately Rome is actually able to take the entirety of Sicily by 210 BC. And this acts as a perfect jumping off point for them to continue their war against the Carthaginians, since they're now substantially, well, not necessarily substantially, but quite a bit closer to the actual Carthaginian coast on northern Africa. So from here, they kind of use it as a launching off point, which they were directly keeping Carthage from doing for Rome, and they are actually able to send more of their troops effectively into Asia and mainland Europe, around the Iberian Peninsula and stuff like that. So they used Syracuse as a vital point to then fight against the Carthaginians. And then we see in 201 BC, when the Second Punic War ends up ending, we see it ends with a Roman victory. So Syracuse acted as a vital point in the turning of the Second Punic War. So it's just really cool to see. And I just wanted to inform you about this not really little known, because I know the Siege of Syracuse is relatively popular. There's multiple artistic depictions of it throughout history and stuff like that. But I just kind of wanted to give it a little bit more of a relatively simplistic, yet definitely quite a bit detailed rundown. But yeah, so that's all it really was for the Siege of Syracuse. And that's all I really have for this episode of Unscripted History. So thank you very much for watching.